Thanks everyone for coming today, especially Tanner, our special guest, Tanner Mirrlees from Ontario, which is where I'm also reaching you from, but from different municipalities in those places. We've been asked to coordinate a special issue of the journal on the crisis of the public commons, and we have this curious title, Democracy by Collision or Connection, the crisis of the political commons. And this has a call for papers or other types of interventions, including videos and podcasts, etc., both in English and in Spanish. And I'm a professor at Lakehead University in Ontario. I've been involved here in the council for several years, and I'm also a member of Media Smarts, the Canadian Centre for Digital and Media Literacy, but also I've had a lot of involvement with the UNESCO MIL. I'm the chair of the Media Education Research section of the IAMCR. So I kind of hang around in a lot of the interesting circles, put it that way, and I get to meet a lot of you interesting people through time. Maria Luisa, I'm just going to make sure I don't forget to introduce Maria Luisa, who is a professor in Cuernavaca, Mexico, at the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Morelos. And that means the Autonomous University in the state of Morelos. And she's the director of a really interesting media and education incubator there. It's the multimodal teaching unit. But it's an inspirational spot. I was lucky enough to visit one time, and Maria Luisa and I have collaborated on a few things now, and this is yet another. So as I said, this today is the English discussion, but this is also going to have some content from the Latin American and Spanish sides. So what is this about? Like commons, I've been looking a little bit, trying to understand myself a little better. Things like air, water, and land are historically known as sort of the common entities. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about the commons and media is that space to gather and the ability to have the discursive and other features that are required to have dialogue, right? To be able to communicate together. And so to some extent, and the word voice, is embedded in the call for papers, but, we need space to have voice. We need the space and place and sites. We need the means to have voice. We have to have some control over the mechanisms through which we communicate. And we have to have the capacity for voice. And that's actually where media literacy resides, right? Is in capacity and those sort of learning economies. And what we're, the point, the push, the impact, the factor that's calling us to this issue is the multiple overlapping crises that we see ourselves in, but also the changing nature of the communication space, right? So if we can say that for a moment, that the internet created utopian opportunity, it created space for marginalized voices, it diversified the various inputs from around the world and from within cultures in a dramatic way. Those utopian elements continue to exist, right? Like we want to say, yes, the internet is a utopian space. The internet is a place for diverse voices. The internet is a place where we can speak to power. We can, have those meaningful dialogues. But what's happened as well, and I've called it actually here in my notes, the unweb. Like what has undone this, right? And I'm just going to mention three factors: monetization, disinformation, and I'm calling the third one welcome to the machine. So the first two involve scatological references, I'm sorry to say, but Cory Doctorow, a Canadian author now living in the US, refers to the enshittification of the internet. So it starts with great promise. It draws us in. We get, have these wonderful little spaces and opportunities, and then it gets worse. And in fact, that someone's trying to extract value from it. So it becomes a monetary game. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is the disinformation, and this is the bots. It's everything else. It's the trolls. It's the so-called foreign influence, etc. But I want to again another scatological reference. The Steve Bannon, who's a well-known American political operative, says, the Democratic Party, and he's referring to one of the two parties, is not the enemy. He says the media is, and he says the solution is to flood the zone with shit. He says so. In fact, that's something about this information economy and this overload of information. In Spanish, they say infotoxication, right? So it's Maria Luisa will pronounce it better later, but that information is sort of in overload, and there's lots of false stuff floating around. And the final piece is welcome to the machine, right? So it's the bots, it's the algorithms, it's the AI, and these are all complicating factors, and we can spend hours on any and all of those things. Here in Canada, there's a group of people that are advising the Canadian government. They have just published something called the Policy Horizons Report. And of the various risks in the near future, and these are not just communication, there are many other things, but the one risk which is both highest impact and highest likelihood is what they said is that people cannot tell what is true and what is not. And it says that this is something that Canada should brace for within 3 years. I mean, we know that we're already contending with these conditions, but the point is that what we see today is not necessarily the end, that this can get worse. So there's lots to deal with here. And we've brought today, we've invited someone whose expertise is in the political economy of media, who spends a lot of time thinking and talking about these things. Tanner Mirrlees, associate professor at a university that's actually geographically quite close to me here. We've never met in person, but he works and teaches at the Ontario Tech University. And in Canada, he has held the role of the president of the Canadian Communication Association. So he's been the big wheel. But Tanner, of the many things you've done, the 7 books, one I think would be of great interest here, but we won't be talking about it much today, is your work on ed tech. I mean, I've listened in on some of the webinars and things that you've done, and it's always really interesting. But what I hold in high esteem, I see also that you've won teaching awards. There's much that you've been doing that people are very excited about. But what I want to speak to is your work as a public intellectual and the work you do in podcasts and that type of work of translation and communication and trying to make it, these important issues something that others can, that more people, creating common space for dialogue. Like you're a leader. So I'm really happy that you could join us today. And I get to ask you the first question, and we've prepared those. So I will go right into that, and soon I will relinquish, and Maria Luisa will take over. Don't worry. So, we were going to ask you that this dystopian elements, the big, some of the 3 I mentioned, seem to have become dominant. This is the dystopian elements of the internet. This would be too big a topic to go into detail. So let's look specifically at how the ownership of walled gardens, and actually in the Spanish world, Carlos Alberto Scolari, in his book, The War of the Platforms, La Guerra de las Plataformas, talks about those walled gardens and the impact of those, the way that the wide open space of the internet was then corralled. But you have another term, Tanner, but you mentioned the people who are involved, the tech bro philosopher kings. So how are the walled gardens and the tech bro philosopher kings contributing to a diminished public space?
That's a great question. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, and congratulations also on the special issue. It's so timely and needed. And I just wanted to say I'm really grateful to be invited here to share some thoughts with you and others. And I really love this collaborative and dialogical format. Like, there's such a great way to sort of facilitate, ideation and collaboration and knowledge generation for articles in a special issue of a journal. So thanks to you and everyone for facilitating this connection. As for the, how tech bro philosopher kings are contributing to a diminished public commons by establishing and reproducing walled gardens online, as opposed to a public commons. It might be useful just to start again with revisiting the idea of the public commons and then talking through how the internet, which very much started as something public, became privatized over the years and now is basically presided over by 5 companies and the CEO tech bros at their commanding height. So I'll riff a little bit on that topic. So, I mean, as you mentioned, a public commons consists of shared resources that are accessible to all members of a community, and usage of the public commons is regulated to ensure the resources of that commons are sustainable and available and equitably distributed over time. So, you know, the idea of the internet early on was very much of a digital public commons, as you mentioned, Michael, and this is a very appealing vision. And in the early days, even after it was privatized in the mid-90s, the internet was still being imagined as this open space to gather for public expression and knowledge sharing and more. And many of us are still using it for those ends and hoping that it can be or realize its potential as a public commons, as you say. So I'm not ready to give up on the common ideal of the internet, even though it has very much been privatized. Political economists such as myself and those I learned from over the years, such as Dan Schiller, Robert McChesney, Vincent Mosco, who tragically passed away a few months ago, show the internet largely to have become a servant of global digital capitalism, totally financialized, part of large corporate structures, wedded to commercial and advertising values, and doing more. So today, the major internet sites and services are owned by a few colossal companies, those being the AMM, or what used to be called the GAFAM, the AMM being an acronym for Alphabet, Google, Apple, Meta Platforms, Amazon, and Microsoft. And these companies provide, basically a number of services and preside over a privatized internet, not a genuine digital public commons, which would entail some form of public or cooperative ownership. So the tech bro CEOs at the helm of these firms, have erected, as you say, walled gardens. These are enclosed proprietary platforms where most users of the internet, all of us, now go to do things like communicate, impart and receive information, and creatively collaborate. And so the agency and interactivity and that will to common that expresses sort of our desires as human beings to commune and collaborate and communicate is very much taking place in and through proprietary platforms owned by some of the biggest tech companies on the planet. And so I can talk a little bit more about the business operations of those and how those business logics kind of perhaps diminish the prospect of a public commons as well. So there's 5 sort of business logics at play that we could look into as diminishing the public commons. So the first is just monopoly and oligopoly markets. In capitalism, competition between lots of players often leads to market concentration. It's an interesting paradox in the history of the economic system. Competition leading to market concentration and control. And then new companies ostensibly emerge and disrupt that control and then compete and form new forms of control and market oligopoly or monopoly. The internet has been no exception to that longstanding rule in the economy. So Alphabet Google has acquired 224 companies since its founding, YouTube, Android, Nest Labs, among many others. And even the new artificial intelligence platforms, the AI systems that are said to be disrupting and changing everything, well, their ownership reflects an old entrenched pattern. Nearly 80 startups of these AI firms have been acquired by the AMM since 2010. There's other forms of monopoly or oligopoly. So Google controls over 80% of the search engine market. YouTube presides over much of the creator economy. Meta Platforms has a dominance in social networking, with Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp being used by billions worldwide. Amazon leads in e-commerce, Microsoft in operating systems and software, Apple in smartphones, PCs. And moreover, these sort of monopoly practices have tended to concentrate economic power, decimate smaller businesses, and then lead to the sort of vast enrichment of those CEOs and shareholders, at the heights of these companies, where, as many other people, see their standards of living and their incomes diminish over time. So these are very much sort of monopoly firms. They entrench these monopoly practices, locking users into services and products. So Apple's ecosystem links users into iPhones and Macs and Apple Watch and TV. Google integrates its search engine, YouTube, Gmail, and Android operating system to create an integrated user experience that's monetizable. Apple and Google today control more than 95% of the App Store market, outside of China. So by creating these walled ecosystems, they incentivize us to log into their platforms and their products and never leave. And sometimes it becomes quite difficult to leave due to the cost of shifting service providers. Third, the AMM also expand their monopoly positions to the power of what economists call network effects. Basically, network effects mean this: the social value of an internet site or platform increases as more users join and use them to communicate, and collaborate, creating a positive feedback loop that further enhances their desirability among new or prospective users. So the more users that YouTube aggregates, the more of us want to go to YouTube, because that's where the action's happening. That's where the content's being uploaded. That's where the dialogue and discussion's going on. So this is what economists call a network effects. And as the cycle spins and enlarges, it entrenches the monopoly power of these companies. Also, as you mentioned, Michael, the internet has become very much a site of what some call user exploitation, fertile ground from which user agency and interactivity and all the public forms of expression that billions of internet users create get harnessed and used by big tech companies for their private gain. So Shoshana Zuboff recently coined the concept of surveillance capitalism in her book by the same title, to highlight this practice by which AM turned lives, experiences, communication, and creativity of all of us, and the data our interaction online creates, into a source of private profit. So internet firms basically monitor what we're doing online, what we're searching for, what we're liking, who we're communicating with, who our networks are, where we're posting, what we're reading. And this generates a data profile about our interactions. The companies then harvest sort of that data and use it to sell advertising services to global clients. And so I recently read that the average annual revenue per Facebook user was about $56 in the United States and Canada. So our data annually is worth about $56 per user. And finally, the internet has become very much a space where commercial values predominate and advertiser interests get repeatedly prioritized. So targeted ads, click ads, pop-up ads, search engine ads, all of this prioritizes a logic of consumerism over the public commons and democratic or civic values. Clickbait articles may even distract us from more substantive information, nudging us toward purchasing decisions, not decisions about how to collectively solve the globe's most pressing public problems. When we watch YouTube videos, even the best informational or educational videos posted on YouTube, we're distracted and interrupted by ads for automobiles, Hollywood blockbusters, shoes, shifting our focus from learning and absorbing sort of that information, perhaps to another ethos of consumption. So the internet was originally imagined as a public commons. I think we still can theorize and fight for the ideal of the internet as a public commons, and we can dream of that and work in our policy and our practice to make it so. But its current privatized state is very far from this ideal due to its shaping by the logics of digital capital and the AMM, which very much exercise oligopoly powers over it. So any effort to redesign or remake the internet as a public commons and put it in the service of democracy, I think we'll have to contend with the current private powers that are owning and very much trying to control it. So that's sort of my sense of the tech bros and the tech companies and their sort of perhaps deleterious impact on the internet as a digital public commons today.
Wow, I'm reeling. I feel like I've come off a whirlwind ride in an amusement park, and it feels vertiginous. And I'm like hearing and rereading all these things that I've been paying attention to for years, and you managed to encapsulate into those amazing 5 minutes. Thank you for that. There's something about what's happening to these public spheres. Like, I think maybe the understanding of ownership is one thing that the population can claim, like that we get it. There's these really rich people and there's this stuff going on. I think on the other side, the question around disinformation is actually one where enigma still reigns, right? Like, and I think maybe drawing the metaphor from AI from algorithms, where people are constantly persuaded this is too complicated for you, don't worry about it. Some well-paid person in Silicon Valley is doing their best work to help you. I think with disinformation, something similar is going on, which is that this is way too complicated. You'll never get it. So just bear down and go have a media literacy lesson or something, like figure it out, man. And that's an unfortunate place to be. And I'm wondering about, like, I want to localize that into this question of foreign interference, right? The Chinese or Russian impact on the politics of the moment or the discourse in the internet. I also want to mention to everybody that you've done some really great work. Again, listening to your podcasts about some of the ways that the symmetrization of the digital economy of the United States and China is sort of has been, dealt with. But yeah, so I thought you'd be a really great person to ask this question. So
Yeah, I mean, so the role of foreign actors, I mean, is fascinating when it comes to broader public discussions about media literacy and even democratic or civic literacy. The role of foreign actors and agents in misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda has garnered a lot of attention over the past 10 years by national security planners, politicians, policymakers, the public, educators, news outlets. And the walled gardens of the internet have indeed worrisome geopolitical implications that I'm also interested in. So, we have that issue of ownership and control, as you mentioned previously, as on the mind of the public. But we're very much also concerned of these sort of nefarious sort of actors kind of utilizing or mobilizing algorithms and AI systems and platforms to disinform and manipulate the public mind, and to move people to acting, thinking, feeling, being in ways that might not reflect their overall best interests nor the interests of a functional democracy. So, every major state, I think I'd want to start by saying every major state in the world, including superpowers such as the United States and China, and regional powers such as Russia, India, Turkey, and others, have developed immense capacities for extending their informational and sometimes mis or disinformational influence beyond their territorial borders and through, paradoxically, US-based social media platforms that are owned by those big companies I just talked about. So Facebook, YouTube, X, Twitter, these have all become, in geopolitical or IR terms, a new deterritorialized battle space in which a range of public affairs officers, private propagandists, cyber warriors are fighting it out. And fighting it out for ideological influence, to win hearts and minds, to manufacture, engineer consent to certain policy ideas and big systems of ideas and beliefs and forms of thought that may or may not reflect, reality, as we might sort of come to know it as educators. Some of these influencers are directly employed by government PR or public diplomacy or propaganda agencies and military information warfare units. So when we look at, for example, how the militaries of the US and of China talk about the internet, they very much do talk about it as a battle space, a new space for combat of information warfare. Many of these influencers, many of the promulgators of propaganda, mis and disinformation, labor for strategic communications and marketing companies that are actually not just kind of part of sort of, ramshackle small groups, but often sometimes part of big trade associations or lobby groups for big partisan think tanks or forms of industry. So the internet's very much become an ideological battlefield where lots of foreign and international influencers embed themselves within the domestic communication and media environments of other countries, competing to shape narratives and sway public opinion on behalf of the organizations, governments, non-government, and corporate that pay them to do this. And, I argued in my old book, Hearts and Minds, I gave like 100-year history of kind of like US-based international information, public diplomacy, public affairs, sometimes propaganda campaigns in other countries. And the US has long been a very, very significant force of foreign influence in other countries. But it's not the only country to undertake such efforts, especially not in the 21st century when we see the rise of the so-called BRICS, or particularly of China and Russia forming a new alliance and exercising these new forms of deception and manipulation through the internet. So, Russia and China's ideological activities, their interference, their influence within the US, NATO countries exemplify the trend. They utilize like international broadcasters, diplomacy fronts, cyber warfare units, online trolls, algorithmic bots. to try to impact local perceptions of their own national identities, of their foreign policies, of their cultures, and also to sort of try to vilify or cast aspersions upon the US and its NATO allies. So that's sort of going on. And again, it's incredible because whereas in the Cold War, actors would be using their own kind of homegrown or domestic communication systems to internationalize their influence campaigns. In the 21st century digital age, they are reliant and dependent upon American-based social media platforms to conduct mis and disinformation campaigns elsewhere. Like that's a different sort of logic at play. So, even though, AMA might be dominant in all of these other countries' digital infrastructures and markets, AMM are not necessarily emissaries or servants of what some might at a previous stage of history called American cultural imperialism or Americanization or soft power. So there's a disjunct or a gap between the economic dominance of Silicon Valley around the world and then the utility of that economic dominance to US foreign policy, because we see US's opponents using those very same platforms for their strategic campaigns in the United States and elsewhere. But I don't want to concentrate as much on Russia and China. I mean, they definitely are engaged in information, misinformation, disinformation activities through the internet. But the notion that they are the primary contaminators of public discourse or are solely responsible for democratic decline or dysfunction is way, way too simplistic. It's an all too convenient narrative. It's expedient for politicians in the United States and Canada to blame foreign others for domestic woes, instead of doing an honest probe of the problems with oneself. In my opinion, the attribution of the contamination of public discourse solely to Russia or China, say in the United States or in Canada, is very misleading because it overlooks the substantively toxic and often corrupting role played by domestic actors within the United States, within Canada, that are corroding or corrupting public, civil, and democratic discourse. So, we have to sort of note that historically propaganda, disinformation, misinformation have never been unique to authoritarian or autocratic societies. They are deeply embedded in the histories and practices of liberal democratic countries. There's a wonderful book by Michael Spruill called Propaganda and Democracy, The American Experience of Mass Media and Persuasion, that gives a big history of this. And some of the key works by foundational critical communication media studies scholars, from Harold Lasswell to Walter Lippmann to Edward Bernays to Herbert Schiller to Noam Chomsky, they have a lot to say about the role of propaganda in liberal democracies. So I'll give you just a few examples of this. And, so it's not to say don't sort of think about Russia and China, but it's also to say focus in on the domestic sources of dysfunction, of the corrosive discourse, of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda. Like, before Facebook and YouTube were around, news companies themselves were playing a role in degrading public discourse. So, take Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, right? It was in the late 90s, cashing in on what it called branded infotainment in pursuit of ratings and ad revenue. It prioritized partisan sensationalism and spectacle over factual reporting, using emotion, polarizing narratives to engage a certain slice of the American media market, that being Republicans that did not feel represented by centrist news organizations, and basically capturing their attention with sensation, spectacle, hyperbole, rhetoric, and delivering them to ads for products. Political parties themselves play a role in the propagation of democracy corroding misinformation and disinformation. Think about the enormous sums of money spent on political communications funded by parties and their fundraisers, funneled into Madison Avenue PR firms every time an election happens. In 2016, the Republican and Democrat parties spent nearly $12 billion on political advertising. And there's no way one could convincingly argue or demonstrate that every claim made in the political advertising during that election, both by the Democrats and Republicans, was factually true. Moreover, there's no prohibition or law against outright lying and deception in political advertising in the American political system. So you have legalized kind of, authoritative forms of communication that can entail quite a lot of misinformation or disinformation to win voters to a politician and a party. Trump's campaign team spent $44 million on Facebook ads. Clinton spent $28 million. So this is also kind of can be a problem. So something to look at. Also, big companies have played a role in propaganda. Like take energy companies, big oil, for example, notorious for spreading misinformation, disinformation to protect their interests. Numerous sort of reports have highlighted how ExxonMobil spent millions over many years on PR and third-party advocacy to spread fake news. Why? To create public doubt about the reality of climate change and the scientific consensus on climate change. Why? To stave off public interest regulations that might curb CO2 emissions and lead us to a more sustainable, environmentally sane future. So they're part of the problem as well. Think tanks have a role too. Think about all these think tanks and these trade associations bankrolled by large companies, blue chip companies, billionaires, millionaires like the Koch brothers, spreading the myth of free market economics, the idea that tax breaks for the wealthiest will always already trickle down and lift up everybody else, lift up the working class, ameliorate the conditions of the poor. This has been promulgated, officially by official mainstream sources by nearly 5 decades. It's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's detrimental, lobbied into mainstream public policy for since the late 70s. This lie of trickle-down economics has led to immense wealth concentration among the rich, while the poor now can barely subsist, and the poor is quite angry about that. And then we also have the role of domestic sources of online influence that are also either paid by political parties or organizations, or are working independently or autonomously of them. I mean, I studied really, really awful online influencers from the fascist and right-wing extremist far right for about 5 years. And many of them are based in the United States and Canada. And they are playing a horrible and hateful role in the public sphere, corroding useful discourse, spewing hateful, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, anti-Black, often genocide-supporting narratives and ideologies. So they're not external to the United States or Canada. They are part of it and part of the sort of challenge that we as media educators face. So suffice to say, foreign actors such as China and Russia, they do play a role in influence campaigns, but there's also many domestic sources that I think we have to take more seriously and spend more of our energies as policymakers, as educators in addressing and countering.
Great. Wow, you've really opened clarified something there. That's brilliant. We're concerned about the overblown influence of, the discussion of this foreign influence being overblown. So I'm going to pass the baton to Maria Luisa, and I think we need to maybe, we might need to rein in on one question or else move more quickly through a couple of them, because
Sure.
you've already given us so much to think about, but
I'll abbreviate a few of my other thoughts and responses then. Okay.
Yeah, but so much comes clicking to, so quickly to you. All right, thanks, Maria Luisa.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Tanner. The question I want to make is, I wonder if you could help us to see through and past technological determinism. How are our communication tools shaping our world regarding voice, access, a common space for dialogue? And how do these communication tools simply mirror back processes taking place in the culture at large?
Thank you, Maria Luisa. That's a fantastic question, and I've always been a big challenger to technological determinism. This idea that technology is an autonomous agent that has a will or a mind of its own to shape society in a one-directional manner, determining everything, changing everything all at once for better or worse, and then usually flowing from technological determinism is like a techno-optimism or a pessimism. Everything's changing because of the new device or gadget or platform or software system for the better, or conversely, everything's gone to hell, everything's changing for the worse because of the technology. This really does obscure the human history and the human and social shaping of technology. And I just don't really think it's a good guide to understanding the complexities of our relationship to technology, including social media platforms, nor to the human choices and decisions that shape those platforms for ends that are in turn shaped by larger organizational institutional structures, which are in turn part of a larger society with certain larger economic and political logics at play. I like that sort of topic you mentioned of the internet is mirroring back processes taking place in the larger society and culture. That's a really, really interesting idea. Social media platforms are often perceived as the causes or the catalysts for a better or worse society. But this, I think, overlooks how these platforms may amplify or express existing social problems that are rooted in the economy and the political structure. In her recent book, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World, Naomi Klein argues this point, actually. She says, the internet and social media platforms do not in themselves create social divisions, but rather reflect and amplify pre-existing fractures and antagonisms within the society. So that would seem to relate more to that mirror sort of metaphor that you use. So systemic economic inequalities lead to widespread anxiety, resentment, and anger within the society. I mean, it's not like social media platforms are necessarily causing that anxiety, resentment, and anger, but they may be giving expression to and amplifying it. So, algorithms may amplify and exacerbate as opposed to cause division and polarization. Filter bubbles and echo chambers, may be expressions of communities we already elect to belong to, not necessarily builders of totally new communities. Many problems in democracy and public discourse have deep historical roots that predate the internet. Problems like inequality and sexism and racism didn't start, with the internet or with YouTube or with TikTok. They've been with us for much of human history and in modernity as well. So this all sort of suggests that simplistic technological determinism doesn't really get at the social and cultural determinations of our uses of these technologies for ends good or bad.
Thank you very much. Because yes, you pinpoint something very important. No, it's more complex. No, and we cannot just assume that technology is determining everything. No, we are also shaping what's happening with technology, and we see many gadgets and platforms are like launched for some purposes, and then they transformed based on the use we make of them. No, so Thank you very much. And other thing I would like to retake from the previous conversation was about these utopian potentials of the internet, Michael, and you mentioned about that as these possibilities of a common and horizontal space where underrepresented voices can flourish. Can you comment on the contemporary state of the internet as a commons, but not for the good, as a commons for this disinformation, toxicity, hate speech? That's what it seems we're sharing on the internet. So can you comment on that as opposed to this utopian potential, please?
Sure. I really appreciate that, because I always think we have to take a dialectical or a dimensional or a sufficiently balanced view of these new and emerging technologies, as reduce them to sort of one pole, all good, all right, or another pole, all bad, all wrong. And I think the question you raised sort of, encourages us to think more carefully, as opposed to just sort of repeat or perpetuate all of the potential or existing harms that these social media platforms may do, and to still look for a silver lining, look for sort of imminent potential or even prefigurative sort of possibility in the practices of internet users to realize sort of a better and different society. So indeed, I mean, the internet has enabled people and communities that the legacy media underrepresented, ignored, marginalized, has enabled these people to express themselves, to communicate, to share their voices and narratives and histories and experiences in a way that sort of, legacy news media simply did not consider. There's other sort of different forms of ownership being imagined, like the cooperative and open source movements might be an expression of the internet's utopian potential. By encouraging collaborative development and the free distribution of software, these open source projects can challenge proprietary models of production. By enabling cooperative and peer-to-peer networks, some platforms can be used in support of communities that challenge business logics as usual. For those not afflicted by the digital divide, who are interested in learning, without having to pay high tuition fees, or move to another city to enroll in a college or university. The internet has certainly expanded access to forms of knowledge and education, and enabled more people to pursue and activate knowledge. I do everything I possibly can to try to use the internet and these platforms to share what I've learned and to share presentations and videos and lectures with the world. And I derive a great deal of satisfaction and joy from doing that. And I also consume, or I view, or I watch a lot of incredible online educators. I mean, some of the most interesting and novel forms of contemporary creativity and artistic expression, I think, are happening online. I've long been a fan and follower and subscriber of RedTubers or BreadTubers, such as ContraPoints and PhilosophyTube. And these are trans people who make some of the most entertaining, informative educational videos I've ever seen. And as we know, activist movements are making all kinds of new uses of the internet in pursuit of real utopias that try to move the world beyond the reigning system. I mean, I've written a few essays on how a new generation of democratic socialists formed in the aftermath of Occupy Wall Street and cheered on by Bernie Sanders, one of the United States' most beloved politicians ever. We're using social media to sort of, challenge digital capitalism and challenge the AMM and challenge sort of the immense wealth and political power of these owners of big tech bro companies. So I've written a few papers on that and even participated in alternative, activist movements and communities that have made a lot of meaningful uses of the internet and social media platforms. One of them is called Left Streamed. It was a video archive of all of these different activist events that happened downtown Toronto for over the course of nearly 15 years. And so we basically would host a public event with some activists and community members and educators at the Center for Social Innovation or the Workers' Action Center or a bookstore, and we'd video record those and just put the videos on YouTube. And there's just this massive archive of like events that have happened in Toronto that's open and available for the world to view. So I mean, I'm excited. About these uses of the internet. But my optimism is always balanced with the pessimism of the bigger political economy that I opened with today. And my pessimism also arises when I study, what movements, what parties, what politicians seem to be ascending on the global scene, politically speaking. I study right-wing extremist uses of the internet, and, the far right, not the progressive left, seems to have more influence, both online and increasingly in governments worldwide right now. It's frightening. I'm frightened by the rise of the far right in the formal representative electoral democratic system. So what this means to me is that a quantitative increase in progressive voices online doesn't necessarily translate into qualitative transformation of political victory, decision-making power, influence at the level of the economy or the state or the party system. And I sometimes also fear that, we become trapped in these echo chambers, like even the best of us, like media educators here today, and that we exist in these kind of fragmented, segmented micro communities. And this diminishes our capacities and willingness to engage with other perspectives that are not like our own and pursue some common ground for forging a democratic consensus, which would be essential for effective public good and public interest policymaking. So those are some of the concerns, but I'm optimistic in a lot of ways too.
Thank you very much. You give us hope, but we keep on looking at all these problems critically. I think we need to balance those two, the pessimistic and the optimistic views. Thank you very much for looking at different angles of these problems. And the last question I would like to share is, given the interest of this group in media literacy, what should our students and peers come to understand about the nature of public discourse online? Is it democratic? In the attention economy, our attention can be bought and sold?
Yeah, thank you. I love that this concluding question centers on this relationship between internet or digital communications more broadly, public discourse, and the type of public discourse that is requisite to a well-functioning democracy. I think that I would want students to understand in media literacy experiences and education spaces that, democracy is never pre-given, whether that's online or off. Democracy is not something just enshrined within, legislation or, policy documents or a certain type of government. But the best democracy has always offered all of us is in the actual practices that we as individuals, as citizens, as groups engage in together to try to sort of understand the most pressing public problems of the day and to forge solutions to those problems that benefit the most people. So Democracy's always been an ideal. It was one that we should not, especially not in this day and age where you see authoritarian and autocratic states on the rise everywhere, where you see neo-fascist and far-right extremist groups on the rise everywhere. We need to sort of continuously promote and protect the value of democracy in our communicative practice, online and off. You know, like in modern liberal democratic polities, democracy manifests as either representative democracy, you know, we elect our leaders every few years to rule on behalf of the people, or participatory democracy, where we develop the capacity to try to make decisions that affect ourselves and the communities that we love and belong to. These are, you know, forms of democracy with great potential, but their realization in practice has always been a challenge. Historically, you know, it was the case even in the first liberal democratic states. Presently, reports indicate democracies in peril or in decline, according to different metrics and registers, of course. But democracy, you know, always raises troubling questions. You know, do the people really want to rule themselves? Could the people exercise self-rule in an efficient and effective way? What are the conditions of possibility most amenable to or conducive to genuine self-rule of the people, by the people, for the people? If we are invested in the democratic spirit and say, yes, we believe democracy is about self-rule and that people can exercise this and realize this potential, we need to then commit ourselves to identifying and trying to organize the societal conditions, including the communicative and media conditions most conducive to enabling the majority of people to realize democracy's promise and potential. There's a great documentary by Astra Taylor called What is Democracy? And she says, you know, democracy might have never really substantively fully existed, but we will all surely miss it when it's gone. She draws this poignant comparison. She says, moths never reach the moon, but they navigate by it. We humans may never reach democracy, but we navigate by democracy's ideals. You know, I strongly agree with this sentiment. And so we really have to think through, you know, again, what are the barriers and limits to achieving democracy, even within formal liberal democratic representative systems like, you know, the United States and Canada, and what type of communication and media system is most appropriate, most useful, most effective for realizing democracy's promise. So back to the internet, then I'll just sort of wrap up with a few more thoughts. The underlying economic and political system, I think, very much has come to constrain and perhaps diminish the internet's democratic potential. But within the practices and the experiments and the creations of millions of democratically minded people that are using the internet through online networks and in communities, maybe we can begin to glimpse the prospect of alternative futures and better ways of living together in common. We may never fully achieve the democratic ideal online or off, but striving toward it and finding ways in our collective practice to pursue seemingly impossible or even utopian goals is the starting point for renewing the democratic spirit and building a digital public commons. So we can learn from those proposing things like public service internet platforms, cooperative platforms, alternative non-corporate models of digital life. We can learn from all of those sort of rabble-rousers and activists that are fighting sort of for the best kind of progressive values and virtues. We can challenge the tech bros and envision alternate models of the internet, prioritizing the public good and democratic values and principles and civic life over just private profit. And I think this will require a concerted effort from citizens and activists and policymakers and creators and educators to start thinking how to dismantle these walled gardens and rebuild or design a new digital public commons. So thank you.
I was just thinking, do you use voice to text when you're writing? Because I think you just wrote several essays. Really
Thanks a lot, Michael.
It's great.
Summarizing a lot of things I've been teaching and thinking through.
Yeah, no, I can hear that. I can hear it. I can hear the echoes of some lectures, some great lectures. Karen, are you gonna run the show now?
Oh, well, continue on. Let's open it up for discussion and use the last 25 minutes for anybody to ask questions or further engage with Tanner and our other authors. Antonio has his hand up. Go ahead, Antonio.
Hear me?
Yep.
Yes, thank you. That was great. And in some ways, I think you answered my question in different pieces, but I'd like to sort of consolidate my thoughts. So one thing that I feel optimistic about, but I can't exactly explain in the current environment that we're dealing with, is the way the rise of the student movement to resist the war in Gaza, and it seems to me that in theory, everything's stacked against them. When you look at the US media, and well, first of all, they probably are not engaging mainstream media at all. That's my assumption. I could be wrong about that. But when I see students interviewed, they seem quite articulate, very well informed. And it's somewhat surprising given the way that the algorithms, the tech companies, the mainstream media are all clearly set up to bias US and Israeli native narratives in the media. So I'm wondering what's going on here? Like, how is it that students seem to be so, or young people seem to be so well informed in this media environment? Because I'm quite impressed, and I'm not exactly sure how to explain it.
Thanks. That's a really thoughtful question, Antonio. I mean, I don't have a singular answer to that thoughtful question. And I think that case itself, requires further investigation and study and research analysis. But, as sort of a short sort of response, I think that if we were to study, say, critical political economy of communication, some of the classics by, say, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman on the propaganda model, which presumed sort of, a very select or few number of sources that had a public opinion shaping or creating role, as a result of different filters that sort of produced similar kind of, narratives and frames and agendas that all of us would be kind of exposed to or consuming all at once. That propaganda model is no longer in effect. I do think that the internet and social media platforms have been very disruptive to that way of forging an elite foreign policy consensus, where you usually see a partnership of sorts between various security, foreign policy, and military agencies and their public affairs officers in conjunction with other foreign policy or security think tanks, crafting sort of agendas, crafting dominant frames of reality. And that basically flows down to the public, shaping the public's hearts and minds on a particular topic and issue, and attempting to control it or sustain it for various ends. I think the digital environment's very, very different, and it doesn't operate to similar logics. And so where we see those efforts still within some, large, media organizations, and we see those efforts still within, governments, military, think tanks, and companies. The digital communication environment has afforded many, many young people, alternative networks and channels to gather their own intel, so to speak, and then also create very compelling, very persuasive, sometimes also, quite emotive and affective counter narratives and stories that can just, shape how a generation thinks, perceives, and also behaves in relationship to issues of war and peace. That's novel. I wrote a paper a few years ago that talked about the ubiquitous media war, and I'd be happy to share it with folks, that was sort of looking at the US war in Iraq in 2003, and the kind of selling of that war was kind of like the first moment in which that capacity to effectively manufacture consent broke down. And I think the internet and digital media had a lot to do with that. And we've seen just sort of those tendencies emerge over time. So we see efforts to control narratives, to control agendas, to control frames, but those efforts don't always prove effective. And I think in this case of Israel-Gaza sort of war, the sort of student protest and encampment movements, the widespread challenges that are taking place to that are indicative of that change. But they're also indicative, I think, of a disconsensus within official foreign policy and national security issues. So when we go back and we study, for example, media coverage of the Vietnam War, some people would attribute the anti-war movement to, the journalists were liberal and they were, showing, atrocities and representing suffering civilians and showing American soldiers, crying and being injured. And that sort of created dissent in the public, which led to the anti-war movement. But that's really not the same thing. I mean, you also saw a breakdown after the Tet Offensive in the Republican Democratic consensus on that war that opened up more space within the state, within the political party system, to then impact the way the news media was covering the issue, and then sort of galvanize or give more encouragement to those peace activists. So there's a lot going on there, but I appreciate the question, Antonio. Thank you.
All right, Jeff, go ahead.
Hi, thanks a lot. Your talk has been terrific, and it's just, there's so much, it's so loaded. I want to kind of follow up with Antonio's question, because I'm at UCLA, and every day students are being arrested, and the pro-Palestinian movement really seems to be spreading internationally. I mean, UNAM, places all across the world, students are pushing back and speaking up against kind of what hasn't been challenged much in terms of the U.S. support of, this massive war crimes, genocide, whatever you want to call it. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your ideas about how the internet has played a role in this kind of popular student uprising.
Sure, that's really thoughtful, Jeff. Thank you. I'd like to preface kind of that notion of change, where the internet, where social media platforms can be playing a role in sort of activating students or introducing students to sort of counter narratives and then mobilizing them to take action in encampments and street protests and so on. With something that I've come to understand in the history of foreign policy and its relationship to communications and media. Publics don't determine foreign policy. There sometimes has been an assumption that even when, everyone's using communication and media to express their dissent, to organize anti-war and peace movements and activist practivists, that would then in turn move official foreign policy, strategic security decision makers to change what they're doing. And I think that I learned a lesson during the early 2000s around the Iraq War, when you had the largest ever global transnationally coordinated preemptive, movement against a war. People marching the streets everywhere. Public opinion wasn't aligned with the Bush administration's war. Everyone was saying, no, 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 don't do it for like 5-6 months. And then the state still went to war. So I just want to caution, like, whatever enthusiasm might be here, because I think what we're seeing today is, yes, more people are using the internet. They're using YouTube. They're using TikTok. They're using Instagram. They're using X, Twitter. They're using sort of WhatsApp to not only share information in a many-to-many model of network communication interaction, and they're doing a lot of that. There's a lot of people posting so many videos, so many memes, so many posts, and they're themselves the sources of this peace or anti-war information. But I don't know if that itself will necessarily change the official foreign policy position of government. It might. It's changing public opinion. It might be more difficult for a politician to be elected if they take the identical position they have on Israel-Palestine over the past 70 years or so. That might change. And so you might gradually see some change within the electoral system, whereas by young voters will be not inclined to sort of, elect a president who is, very, 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 very predisposed to the one narrative as against the other, and one policy position as against the other, and the experiences and stories and lives of one people's as opposed to the other. So that's new, but time will tell. And I feel slightly uncomfortable saying anything definitive about the role of the pro-Palestinian student movements and encampments, because I just haven't studied it closely. But I think that's a very, very interesting sort of site for new research analysis. These bottom-up uses of the internet, of social media, for alternative and activist forms of communication that part ways or disrupt or express dissent against a longstanding official foreign policy position. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, Renee, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, thank you for this extraordinary synthesis. There's brilliant organization of information. I appreciate it so much. I'm going to ask a prior question that I've been thinking about a long time, about the role of the humanities in all of this. We're educators on this call, and Maria Luisa asked a question about our students and what we teach them. This has to be, of course, over the long haul, because the humanities have been so diminished in the universities. And we can find evidence of that everywhere. Philosophy, history, as you yourself, represent extraordinarily in that bookcase behind you. And I've been wanting, and I didn't know if it was appropriate to maybe write a piece for this journal on the need to return the study of the humanities into our larger analysis as we must, of our technologies. I mean, let's just say these students have empathy and compassion. Let's just say they see pain. Let's say they see excess. You know, we could look at it from innumerable points of view. I guess my question to you is, do you agree that that we need to restore the humanities? And, by the way, which I starred 1,000 times, alternative futures. That is, we need to be visionaries. We need to see the larger human capacities, and we need to create a view. I think sometimes our film world does that. We don't talk about films much. We talk a lot about politics, but I think the gravitation toward, you know, these universes that have mysteries and reconciliations and space and so on. This is not so far away as we think. So my goal is to say, is there a place for humanities? Where is it? And how do we begin it again from our perches in universities and so on? It will take some time, and maybe mobilizing different groups that have not been a part of the media literacy movement. So I wonder your opinion on that, or anybody else's.
Yeah, I so appreciate that, Renee, and I am a 100% devoted supporter, protector, promoter of the mission of the humanities historically and presently. And I fear that the structures and organizations and institutions of the society are very much not sharing our enthusiasm and our passion and our love for these disciplines, nor necessarily even understanding the value it provides to a good democratic society and the civic life of the citizenry in it. My book, EdTech Inc., co-authored with Shad Alvi, is quite a dismal picture of what the higher education system has become over the past 50 years or so. We see, for example, many of the problems of the neoliberal political economy being kind of reproduced, amplified, institutionalized by colleges and universities over time. There's defunding issues. There's efforts basically by those on the right to say that, the only function of public education is to basically create human capital for capital to use after these individuals have graduated. The training or vocational thrust that has always been balanced with a more humanistic education for democracy thrust of higher education seems to be taking precedence, seems to be the dominant logic of education today, where, we might say there's been this tension, of course, between what do we do as educators? We train people for the economy, we equip them with knowledge and skills pertinent to different occupations and different industries and different sectors of the economy so that they may go graduate and have their labor power used to benefit others. And that's always been sort of one of the logics or justifications for education. But the other, of course, is much better and profoundly more humanizing and humanistic, which was we are here to cultivate free-thinking citizens for a well-functioning democracy in pursuit of higher meanings and exploring the meanings of life. And everything else. And I fear that those humanistic values, they're not only being directly attacked by many mainstream politicians, but we have generations of students being socialized not to understand that education could be something other than a training system for the economy or a training system for big capital or firms. And as educators, we find ourselves in a very precarious position because we're trying to defend and promote and protect, the values of the humanities and even the social sciences that we came of age in and that we've benefited from and that we feel a great deal of love and passion for, all the while having both administrations in universities and colleges, think tanks for larger companies, government politicians and policymakers basically saying, those are no longer the values that we think the education system should express. And even when they do say we think they should express those values, it's because they result in soft skills. So we all used to play this game where we now are justifying humanities and social sciences because of the soft skills that are, of course, in demand by all contemporary employers. And there's truth to that. We can be strategic. We can play a rhetorical game, and we can mobilize those arguments to justify and defend what we do. And I understand why we do that, but it just feels so sad to me, to live in a world, to live in a society, to live in a democracy, which doesn't, value the humanities and doesn't value the types of thinking and being that affords, educators and learners. So I don't know how to turn this around. This is the accumulation of 50 years of basically a social re-engineering by neoliberal states and parties and politicians and policies on behalf of global companies for the most part. And to undo that and then to sort of remake education, I don't know, perhaps that's why what we see sort of going on the internet and in digital communication spaces can also provide us with some hope, because again, as I mentioned earlier, I think some of the best public education is happening on YouTube, by these kind of creators and these educators that are connecting with millions of young people and presenting, ideas in a highly informative and entertaining way. But I still think there's a major place for universities and colleges and for also professors and the classroom, the traditional classroom even. But I'm concerned about the future for us in the humanities and social sciences.
All right, thank you. Venue, go ahead.
Thank you. It's been wonderful and absolutely fantastic, as everybody else has said, Tanner. Really been a privilege to be listening to you. My question is actually at the opposite spectrum of what Antonio and Jeff were talking earlier in terms of young people. And I'm wondering what you think about the situation of the economies globally of different countries and the lack of employment for young people, and how that is fueling the money that is going into employing them to become trolls or abusers online. And I'm talking from India, and also we've just seen our election being getting over, and we know that a lot of unemployed young men get employment to do this kind of propaganda and other kind of violent work online, and are probably funded by political actors. And you were talking earlier about domestic actors playing a big part on the internet. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit about, is there a link between what's happening to the economy? And we were just talking about, young people being trained for the labor market. So what are we training our young people for? And where is that marketplace? And if the internet becomes that marketplace where they then get employed, and for what use? So, those were just some of the thoughts I had.
I think that, economic inequality leads to political resentments, discontents, anger, alienation that then does unfortunately fuel the rise of extremist and reactionary, political practices among the young and the old. So I wouldn't say it's a youth problem. I think it crosses generations. You can sort of look at people that might have had a decent employment relationship of standard employment to a firm over 30 years, having their job outsourced or automated, and then basically sort of waking up the next morning and saying, what's become of my life? What's become of society? And they start looking for narratives to help them explain their economic woes. And unfortunately, they turn to the internet, and there's no shortage of conspiracy theorists and propagandists that are providing them with skewed, very partial, very selective, very distorting, very distracting, very, very harmful and often hateful narratives about why their situation is the way it is and what the precursors to them becoming what they've become have been. And many young people indeed are sources of this disinformation or misinformation or conspiracy narrative, because they themselves are living a very precarious life. They themselves have been told by governments, by companies, by universities and colleges even, that there are no guarantees anymore. Your life will be one of insecurity, of risk-taking, of precarity. And what are you going to need to do? You're going to need to get entrepreneurial. You're going to need to basically create your own business, your own gigs. You're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to do this and that basically to make your way. And so many might actually participate in these rituals online. One, because it's a job, it's a gig. You can be sort of a disinformation activist or activator for some sort of junk sort of front group for some other group and make some money doing that. Also, there's that individual sortalized incentive to become influencers for the far right. It's usually the sort of right-wing organizations and their big sort of moneyed and corporate backers that are paying for disinformation information services, and not sort of left-wing organizations, because we're always cash poor and don't have big companies backing our communication and media campaigns. So you basically have sort of like huge companies and think tanks and lobbies associated with them bankrolling online influencers to basically spew propaganda, disinformation, information. And in that way, disinformation and misinformation has become big business in and of itself. I mean, you can just think of the role of these sort of various sort of networks where a number of right-wing influencers have followers in the millions. And they all basically share content with each other. They interact with each other. They create networks effects with each other. They create echo chambers and filter bubbles that expand and bring more young people into them and create sort of a new common sense about the ways of the world. And many times those common sense positions don't actually reflect reality nor the sources of the problems that they're trying to solve through their online practices. And so I don't know. I just think there's just been a perfect storm. You have economic precarity. You have sort of a erosion of even liberal democratic norms and values. You have a lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of worry by many, many people across generations. And that makes them more inclined to take an easy explanation of the way the world works, as opposed to think more deeply or comprehensively about why the world is the way it is, what various changes happened over time to produce the outcomes that might be harming them or making it difficult for them to land a job or sustain a job. And I just think there's also just a vast absence of sufficient political economic literacy. I really do feel that if more young people genuinely understood how the economic system of capitalism works, the role of states or governments in relation to that economic system, the policy choices that politicians and parties have made over 50 years to restructure a society that largely does prioritize and privilege the interests of the so-called 1% vis-a-vis the 99%. And then actually said there's ways that we can think about democratizing our life, achieving sort of our democratic ideals, as opposed to turning to authoritarianism or some right-wing version of fascism. We'd all be better for that. But I think that has to happen at the top. I think that the decision makers, politicians, even leaders in business would have to say, we have to get real. We have to get honest with the decisions that have made for 50 years to produce this vast inequality. And unless we're willing to address inequality and the roots of inequality and try to do something about that, we can only sort of, unfortunately, imagine a future that will become more dystopic, more polarized, more divided, more antagonistic, more conflict prone. And that's not the future that I want to live in. But I, as an educator, don't unfortunately have the power to change the dominant political economy of global capitalism. I can just read about it, write about it, and try to inform and educate others about it. That's a rant, I'm sorry.
Yes, no, that's all right. We have two people who have questions, so we're going to stay on and keep going with Ram and Alice, and then we'll wrap it up after that. So Ram, go ahead with your question.
Excellent. Thank you, Tanner, for that whirlwind tour through a lot of different concepts and linking them all up. I mean, there's so much food for thought here that I'm still struggling to put it all together in my head right now, to be very honest. So thank you for that. A lot of things to take away. But I'd like to touch on two things that you refer to. One, of course, what you just said, which is that young people often don't have a deep enough understanding of the political economy to start with, understand what capitalism means. And also something you referred to while you were talking earlier, which is to talk about the whole idea of democratic ideals and reaching for democratic ideals and how that's linked to the idea of understanding the internet as a utopian space, perhaps, and how to keep that concept alive. But linking some of those, I've seen a lot of research over the years. I remember something, in fact, as far back as 2013 in, I think, the Atlantic Journal of Communication, talking about how, media literacy supports civic engagement, right? But I'd like to turn that upside down. How much do you think of our current predicament in terms of disinformation, misinformation, in terms of even maybe the rise of walled gardens, techno bros, all that is a result of a lack of adequate, emphasis on civic studies, on understanding duties, on understanding democratic ideals? Have we stepped away from that and in that sense resulted in a situation where people don't understand those ideals anymore and therefore are willing to succumb to this level of, of being colonized for their data and in some ways glorifying, the Musks and the Jobses of this world?
I agree. I mean, again, it's back to the earlier question about the value of humanities and social sciences at every level of the education system, and perhaps by extension, just media literacy, is embedded or encoded within curricular design at every level of the education system. These areas have been de-emphasized, deprioritized, defunded, scrutinized, delegitimized, attacked, and also more noxiously and notoriously in the context of the United States, seen to be the source of some left-wing conspiracy against the actual people and against the interests of learners and ordinary working folks. It's just abominable. I mean, when you see basic history being censored in the country that prides itself and promotes itself as the center of liberal democracy around the world, where the history of slavery itself becomes contentious to be taught in a public school system, where the rights sort of, of LGBTQ plus people and the hard fought won rights of those people is something that's now seen to be an expression of some left-wing conspiracy against the people, as opposed just to history and people from below organizing to fight for the realization of their rights, which would seem to be consistent with the American democratic spirit. So you now have what I think many people in the United States, many Americans actually being anti-American, if we are to basically say that America in some way connotes liberal democracy, or at least the values and principles of it. But they are imagining themselves strangely as patriots that are protecting America from either internal bad enemy, deviant others, or external foreign actors that are in some way responsible for these things. So I mean, I would love to see civics. I would love to see humanities and social science disciplines and fields. I'd love to see media literacy encoded, embedded, designed into education at every level, not just something that's added on or siloed or put into some sort of small department that nobody necessarily needs to take seriously. I mean, we live in an information, communication, and digital media environment. It is part of everything we do. It is part of the way we work, the way we learn, the way that we commune, the way we collaborate, the way that we do politics. It's everything. And yet few people seem to actually say we should all be learning about this. And again, that's an education policy problem. It's not a problem of media literacy educators. It's an educational policymaker problem. It's a political problem. And if we want to find a solution, I think we have to do more than just affirm and celebrate the very good work that is happening online by all the creators I follow and all the educators online that are posting. We have to say, how do we think politically about this and actually support political parties and policies that will revivify and augment and enhance and create new conditions of possibility for the flourishing of the humanities and of civics at all levels of the education system. We need it more than ever.
Wow. Go ahead, Alice.
I think you might be muted, Alice.
You just mentioned about the monopoly of the IT giants companies. And in the field of news, and we also worry about, the IT companies are swallowing journalism. So take away the news companies' online revenues, their audiences and also their data, their content. Then what is your view about the implication, the IT companies on news,
That's a great
And also it has a great implication on democracy as well.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Alice. I mean, I think that the way that some colleagues in the United States, such as Robert McChesney or Robert's student Victor Picard, would answer the question, say that we need to think carefully about a different or alternative model for funding the news. We should have always perhaps been doing that. We should probably be investing more in public service news, as opposed to news that is primarily dependent upon subscriptions by paying readers or listeners or viewers, and or advertising revenue to pay the staff, to pay the workers, to pay for the lights, to pay the bills, and so on. The big tech companies have had an absolutely disastrous and deleterious effect on the capacity for news organizations to do what they've always done, which is, in the best case scenario, inform the public or provide a watchdog role of some kind. Now, that might romanticize the news organizations because, as I've said, the news have also, in many contexts, been sources of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda for the powers that be. But ideally, the news would be playing an informational role that would provide the citizenry with the information it needs to know to make informed or reasonable decisions about how to live, about how to navigate the most pressing policy and public problems of the day. It would also be a watchdog that would speak truth to power, that would hold the powerful to account, that would ferret out fact from fiction, it would demystify propaganda, it would provide people with the truth, and basically encourage forms of reform or even revolt if, you know, the powers that be in the larger system or structure are corrupting or having a corrupting influence in the society. News hasn't always played that role, but it had an ideal or a mandate to play that role. With the rise of big tech and internet companies, the fiscal basis, the economic basis of those news organizations was largely eroded, where all of a sudden the ad revenues were flowing not to news journalism, but to these platforms, causing a major business crisis in the very model that sustained the news over time. The response to that might be, you know, I don't think we're ever going to return to a golden age where the news will be paid for by advertisers or subscribers. We're living in a different environment now. So maybe we need to think that the very structure of the news, to think about new models of the news that would be based more around public service values. Maybe we need bigger PBSs. Maybe we need bigger CBCs. Maybe we need better BBCs. Maybe the news should have never been something that was just left to large companies to vertically integrate and control and, you know, extract ad revenue from. Maybe the news has a higher function and mission in a democratic society that should not be subordinate to capital and profit making. That's a bigger philosophical and also political discussion. But I think some of the best advocates for public media and public journalism in the United States right now, such as Victor Pickard and previously Robert McChesney, have made.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to take the moment to thank again Tanner for giving us of his time and putting a tremendous amount of thought into sort of how he would, you know, focus his comments, etc. It's been very helpful. And if everybody has another hour, I have about 16 questions asked Tanner, but I think we'd have to.
We'll do it another time. Hopefully we'll meet in person somewhere as well. I wish I could be there in Portugal.
And the problem with a Zoom talk too is we don't, I mean, we can see that Tanner's getting a little bit fatigued through, you know, all the questions, etc. But at least if we were together, we would feel that more. So here right now, we're willing to just keep on going, you know. But no, I think we know how a question period goes. There's a certain point where you say, okay,
yeah,
I think we've had our time. But thank you.
We'll talk more in the future for sure. And thank you for organizing this. It was such a great pleasure and privilege to be here. And I had a great experience chatting and learning with all of you today. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Take care.